So, a little while back I jokingly bemoaned the fact that I don't get advanced review copies of games. Well, the universe must have been listening because I managed to get my hands on an early copy of one of the biggest releases in years, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Of course, this isn't quite what I had in mind. I had to share this honour with the rest of Australia and a big chunk of Europe, but hey, at least I get to make some Americans jealous. Anyway, I've decided to take this opportunity to do a review that I'll actually be able to release at roughly the same time as the big boys. Will anyone want to hear my opinions about a brand spanking new release? Probably not, but then I can't imagine why anyone would want to hear my opinions about anything at all. So, nothing ventured, nothing gained, to coin a cliche. Now, I wasn't joking in my April Fool's video when I said that Final Fantasy VII was one of the most significant and impactful experiences of my gaming life. Thanks to the fact geographic restrictions played a bigger role in game distribution back in those days, I never had a chance to play a Final Fantasy game before 7, and it was such a new and different type of game for me that it actually took me a while to get into it. But once I did, well, I really got into it. It still sits high on my list of all-time favourite games, and the Final Fantasy series is, by a wide margin, my favourite game series. So, when the remake was announced, I was overjoyed, right? Actually, no. I was mildly intrigued, sure, but on the whole I was a little disappointed. One of my favourite things about the Final Fantasy series is that the main games are so different from each other. I have huge respect for Square's willingness to experiment with different settings, characters and themes, and even when those experiments fail to please large sections of the fanbase, I personally haven't been disappointed in the slightest. And the thing is, the original Final Fantasy VII holds such an important, crystal clear place in my memory that I really didn't think I needed a remake. It is what it is, and what it is an absolutely amazing game, a breathtaking rollercoaster ride of a story with iconic characters, memorable locations and stunning twists and turns, and none of that was diminished in my mind by the crude character models or the static low-res backgrounds. A remake, I thought, would be an interesting exercise. But on the whole, I kind of wish they'd just devote their energies and their genius towards creating Final Fantasy XVI. But clearly a lot of other people were ecstatic to hear of this remake. I still remember seeing the crowd respond to the very first announcement, and although I personally had mixed feelings about it, I nevertheless found the pure unadulterated joy that took hold of the room was something that touched even my curmudgeonly old emotions. And then, as time went on and more trailers were released and more details of the remake became known, I found that I was warming to the prospect of a remake. With every new bit of footage, it became more and more apparent that they were giving this project the respect and the care it demanded. I saw that they were willing to take chances, and didn't feel obliged to stick 100% to the old game, which also gave me hope. Indeed, by the time the game's release drew near, I was as excited as anyone to get my hands on a copy. And so I was legitimately thrilled to be lucky enough to be one of the millions who were able to acquire a copy a week or so before the official worldwide release. Of course, the reasons behind the early release are a bit grim, but I guess it's a silver lining on a very dark cloud indeed. No pun intended. So, it's out, I've played it through to the end, and there's only one word I can think of to deliver my verdict. It's a triumph. Oh, two more things before I get properly started. Firstly, you might notice the inverted commas around the word review in this video's title. I'm not really a reviewer, and I'm not very good at objectivity, and I am a self-admitted Final Fantasy fanboy, so you might want to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Furthermore, I obviously came to this game with very different perspectives and expectations than someone who had never played the original, and in all honesty, I can't begin to imagine how the remake will appear to someone not intimately familiar with the original. I strongly suspect that everyone, from Final Fantasy newbie to hardcore series veteran, will be able to greatly enjoy the remake, but the nature of that enjoyment may well differ significantly. I'd actually be very interested to know what series newcomers think of this remake, so please leave a comment if that applies to you and you feel like making your thoughts known. Secondly, I will be keeping this as spoiler free as possible, but I will be showing little snippets from at least the first half of the game. I'll try to steer clear of anything too significant, but if you truly want to go in as blind as possible, and I can totally understand that, you may not want to watch any further. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get on with it. Sometimes a developer will release a sequel or a reboot or a remake of a successful game, and it will become immediately apparent that the developer had no real idea what made the original so beloved by its fans in the first place. That is absolutely not the case here. Square know exactly why we love Final Fantasy VII. In fact, I think it's fair to say that they love it too, and in just the same way as we do. I don't mean they possess some arrogant, self-congratulatory conceit. I mean that the creation of the original game was a labour of love, and the development of the remake was a chance to revisit that love, tempered by a passion and respect that has matured over the decades. I'm extrapolating, of course. I can't know what the development process was like, but it's tough to play this game and not conclude that it was crafted by people who share my deep and abiding love for Final Fantasy VII. Every environment, every character model, every frame of animation is either a painstaking reimagining of an element of the original, or, even more impressively, a painstaking new imagining of an element that wasn't in the original, but nevertheless fits so perfectly into the game world, it's tough to believe it wasn't always there. And it is indeed the game world itself that has received the most obvious and extensive upgrade. Square made no secret of the fact that this first game in the remake project would be entirely constrained to Midgar, the bustling metropolis with an almost steampunk edge that was the setting for the original game's first 4 or 5 hours. That was a source of some concern for me when I first heard it, because I'd have to say that Midgar is my least favourite section of the original, and I was worried about just how limited this first remake game was going to be. Turns out there's nothing limited about it. Pretty much every part of Midgar from the original has made it into the remake, except of course it's been recreated to meet or exceed the highest standards of modern gaming technology. Well, in most places anyway. If you look closely enough you'll see some low poly models, and there are some textures that are so low resolution they really look out of place. But I'd say this is forgivable. Square have said that no two areas of the game share models or textures, so even with the game's massive 100GB install, it's understandable that not everything can be super high res. And honestly, it barely matters. As impressive as the technology mostly is, it's the artistry that is much more important. And there's just so much artistry on display here. So many times I found myself looking at some small environmental detail and marvelling over how perfectly they'd captured both the look and the spirit of the original. One of the reasons I was concerned that the entire game world would be set in Midgar was the fact that I personally think Final Fantasy games tend to be at their best when they deal with either natural environments or clean, exquisitely designed high-tech cities. This remake has almost none of the former and only a little of the latter. The majority of the game takes place in the slums of Midgar, a setting of dilapidation and chaotic sprawl, and I worried that the game would become monotonous in its visual aesthetic. In a small way, that worry was justified. There were a few times when I started to get sick of dingy alleyways and industrial disrepair, but that never lasted long. Even in the darkest parts of the slums, there were numerous points of interest, not to mention a constant stream of people and sounds and animals and life in general. And the industrial areas were varied enough that they never wore too thin. And of course, there were quite a few areas that were a lot more colourful, vibrant and interesting than others. People who have played the original game probably have some ideas of what those areas might be, and without giving away too much, I'll just say that you're right to look forward to seeing them. I think a lot of the credit for the visual appeal of the game has to go to the lighting. The time of day shifts as the story progresses, which can bring drastic and utterly convincing changes to the environments, changes that both add variety and affect the overall mood of the game. The biggest problem with the visuals, and honestly the only significant flaw that the game has in my opinion, is the character models of the background characters. You can really tell which characters merited a proper polish and shine from the designers, and which didn't. Some of the minor NPCs you talk to have rather crude models, and the lip syncing can be at times hilariously bad. It's pretty jarring actually. As for the main characters though, nope, no complaints there. The playable characters are modelled and animated nigh on perfectly, and so are most of the more important non-player characters. It's an incredible thrill to see characters who, 23 years ago, were just a few dozen flat-shaded polygons, brought to life in a way that somehow still captures the precise look and feel of those crude old models. Ultimately, this is a fine looking game, and more importantly, in every way that matters, it's true to the essence of the original. One of the biggest questions most of us had about the remake was, naturally enough, how it would handle the story. Somehow 4 or 5 hours of content would need to be adapted into a full-length game, and it is rather long. It took me just under 40 hours to get through, so basically a tenfold increase over the original Midgar section. Would there be unnecessary padding? Or would we get meaningful and important additions to a narrative many of us know and love so well? This is something that I can't really discuss fully in a spoiler-free review, but I would say that while there is a small amount of unnecessary padding, the vast majority of the narrative in the remake is precisely what longtime fans will want. We get to learn more about all the characters and the world they inhabit, and there are new characters as well. For me personally, the biggest beneficiary of this narrative expansion was Aerith. To be brutally honest, I always found her a slightly insipid character in the original, but in the remake, well again, I won't say too much, but I like her a lot more now. I can't know how everyone will react of course, but I'm fairly confident that most people won't find too much to complain about with regards to the story, and the way the characters we've loved for 2 decades are portrayed in the remake. And if you haven't played the original, I'd say everything about it, the narrative still holds up damn well. And now I'm going to admit something that will probably make you understand why I stress that I'm not really much of an objective reviewer. The thing is, I usually don't care a great deal about the combat in JRPGs in general, and Final Fantasy in particular. So long as it basically works, so long as you can press buttons to make the enemy's health go down and yours go up, so long as it's not a tedious drawn out process, and so long as you gain items and abilities throughout the game to make that process easier, I'm not really that interested in the finer points of the combat. For me, the story, characters and setting are massively more important. So I don't know how others will judge the combat in this remake, but personally I like it a lot. On the surface it's pretty simple stuff, and if you know the original game you'll have a solid grasp on the fundamentals of combat in the remake. You socket materia into your weapons and armour to grant you a variety of abilities and bonuses. You only have a certain number of sockets, so you need to pick and choose which abilities you take into battle. The main difference, of course, is that the remake's combat is real-time rather than turn-based, although I'd argue that there are still elements of turn-based strategy in place. I say this because while you can run and dodge around the battlefield and launch basic weapon attacks at will, most of your abilities are tied to the ATB, or Active Time Battle, gauge, and that only fills at a certain maximum rate, much like in the original. The bigger change that the real-time combat brings about is the fact that positioning matters a great deal. In the original, your characters just stood in a row facing their enemies, and the only positioning decision to be made was whether you should stand closer to or further away from the enemy. But in the remake, positioning is key. Now, if you execute a close-range attack on an enemy that's a little too far away, or manages to move away in the time it takes to perform the attack, it'll miss and you'll expend your ATB gauge for no benefit. Mostly this is a good thing, it keeps you on your toes, but there can be times when it becomes a little irritating, largely because it can be tough to keep track of what's happening on the battlefield. When you enter combat in this game, you're not whisked away to some flat static battlefield like the original. Instead, battles take place, well, wherever they happen to take place. This means that sometimes there will be pillars or crates or whatever obscuring your view. Furthermore, enemies seem to really like to spread out, so keeping track of what's behind you can be tough, and flying enemies can be rather annoying. It's not often a problem, and the game does have a workable lock-on system, but it can be a minor frustration. The other big change brought about by real-time combat is the necessity for character switching, and this is something that's implemented really well. You can only directly control one character at a time, but you can issue commands to any other character at any moment. You can also switch which character you're directly controlling at any point, and this becomes an important and interesting bit of strategy. You see, characters build up their ATB gauge through normal attacks, but taking direct control of them allows you to build it significantly faster. Also, in general, the enemies seem to have a distinct preference for attacking whichever character you're controlling, so you'll find yourself switching frequently, trying to build up each character's ATB gauge to use for magic spells, and maybe holding some in reserve for emergency healing, while trying to ensure that you spend most of your time with the character that has the most offensive and defensive potential. Once you get into the swing of it, combat is fast-paced while still providing plenty of opportunities to hone your tactics. It helps that there are also some truly epic boss fights, especially later in the game, but I won't go into details there. Speaking of epic, then there's the music. I love Final Fantasy music, but that's a pathetic understatement. I have to be careful not to start describing precisely how much I love Final Fantasy music, because once I get started I may never stop. From the crystal theme that opened the very first Final Fantasy game, through to the eclectic masterpieces of the most recent content patches in Final Fantasy XIV, the series has been home to a staggeringly vast range of fantastic music. And of all the games in the series, 7 had one of the most consistently brilliant soundtracks. So when it came to creating the score for the remake, they had some pretty damn solid foundations to work from. But even taking that into consideration, what they've achieved here is almost miraculous. It's not just that there are new and fantastic remixes of classic tunes, although there are. It's not just that there are beautiful new melodies woven into the soundscape, although there are those too. It's the way that every piece of music, the old and the new, the originals and the remixes and the variations, have been adapted and blended into each other in a way that perfectly serves both the story and the world it takes place in. And as the story evolves and changes, so too does the music. It's reactive. Character themes take on different tones as the characters they represent endure tragedy or experience joy, and when the action picks up, the music follows suit. The battle theme is an ever-changing whirl of instruments and musical phrases, most of which you might recognise, but which will often surprise you with the way in which they're presented. And when I say the music has been blended, I truly mean it. Sometimes, when characters meet or come into conflict with each other, so too do their musical themes seem to converge and intertwine, and even stir a little conflict of their own. There is some truly subtle, nuanced orchestration going on. More than once, a simple sequence of piano notes played over mournful strings was enough to bring tears to my eyes. It's just unbelievably brilliant, and even in a series that contains some of the best music ever created, this game stands out. So, time for a conclusion. And I don't know how to put it any better than to say this is one of the very few games that was everything I hoped it would be and more. The only downside, and in the hours since finishing the game I truly am beginning to see it as a downside, is that the wait for the next game in the remake project is going to be truly agonising. I just hope I'm still around to see it. Well, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe or leave a comment if you feel like it. Stuff like that really does make a huge difference. I'm off to play some more Final Fantasy VII. There were quite a few things I missed on my first playthrough. Until next time though, get off my lawn.